People are still coming in, but in the interest of time, I think we're going to get started now. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the very first webinar in our new MRC hosted Global Update series. As the global marine renewable energy market expands, Canadian companies are increasingly well positioned to support projects around the world. The MRC Global Updates webinar series is an exclusive to MRC members, is designed to provide market intelligence on established and key emerging markets across offshore wind and other marine renewable industries. Each session highlights where opportunities are emerging and how Canadian companies can participate. Topics and markets that will be covered are based on previous and ongoing feedback from our members through roundtables, surveys, and general discussions. This inaugural webinar will provide an overview of the global offshore wind industry, briefly highlight activities in established markets, and outline growth trends in key emerging markets, and identify where opportunities exist for Canadian value and supply chain providers to diversify and engage in these markets. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Amanda White. I'm the Senior Director of Operations and Member Services at MRC, and I will be your host for today. Before we get started, I want to take a moment with you all to recognize and acknowledge the traditional territories and Indigenous peoples of the different lands that we are all on today. Given we are coming together today to discuss marine renewables and offshore wind specifically, I invite all of us to think about the impacts that renewable energy projects can have on Indigenous communities and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures to ensure that marine renewable energy projects move forward inclusively and respectfully. And a few housekeeping notes. Before turning this over to our guest speaker, we are recording this webinar and it will be posted on MRC's YouTube page. And after the webinar, we will send an email to everybody with that link, as well as a copy of our guest speaker's presentation. The bulk of today's webinar will be a presentation, which will be followed by a question period. The intention behind this webinar series is really to provide you with information and respond to your questions. So we encourage you to ask your questions while we have an industry expert with us here. Use the chat or Q&A function for questions, and we will do our best to get to them all. I'd like to now welcome our guest speaker, who we are very pleased to have here with us today. Sean Whittaker is a mechanical engineer and co-founder of the World Bank's Offshore Wind Development Program. This program, founded in 2019, has helped accelerate the uptake of offshore wind in over 25 developing countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, India, Brazil, Colombia, and South Africa. He is also the co-founder of the bank's Scaling Wind Program, which develops utility-scale onshore wind projects in developing countries, including Barbados, Ivory Coast, Mozambique, and Mongolia. Prior to joining the World Bank Group in 2011, Sean served as Vice President of the Canadian Wind Energy Association. He started his career in wind in 1993, spending 5 years in Madagascar designing, building, and installing windmills for rural irrigation projects. So thank you again, Sean, for being here today, and I will stop sharing my screen and hand this over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Amanda. I'm just sharing my screen here. Hopefully you can see it.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks to everybody, and Happy New Year for 2026. It's a real pleasure to be with everybody here today. And this is it's a little bit of a homecoming for me, as it were. As Amanda mentioned, I kind of cut my teeth in the wind industry in Canada, and then was with Canwea from from 2005 to 2011 before moving down to Washington, where I joined the World Bank Group. And it was funny for those of you who are participating who were in the onshore wind sector during that time. I remember around 2006, 2007 was the time when I think onshore wind in Canada really sort of moved from the fringes into the mainstream, and it became a big part of the central discussion about energy planning in Canada. And I remember at the time, offshore wind was kind of speculative, and we had some projects that were in BC, like the famous Nikoon project, and we had some projects in Lake Ontario that were in early stages of development. But like as onshore wind was kind of experiencing this expansion in 2006 through 2008, the offshore wind was kind of in the distance, but nowadays we look at onshore wind and you kind of take it for granted in Canada and the US and all around the world, that onshore wind is one of the cheapest forms of new generation that you can get. But back in 2006, that certainly wasn't, we didn't assume that was going to be the case, but now everybody takes it for granted. I think offshore wind over the past 3 to 4 years has really experienced the same thing that onshore wind experienced from 2006 to 2010. It is going through a remarkable growth. Its trajectory and its growth promise is huge. But it's kind of funny sometimes when a new technology is really starting to come into the mainstream, we forget that we've seen this movie before and other technologies have done it, and specifically onshore wind follow the exact same trajectory, just about 15, 20 years ago. So I guess what I wanted to talk about today was some of what we see in the global offshore wind market and some of the growth that leads us to believe that this is really the moment, the inflection point where offshore wind truly goes global. And we believe that offshore wind in emerging markets specifically is a great opportunity that a rising tide has to raise all boats, and we think that for offshore wind to truly take its place as a major generation technology globally, it really has to grow in emerging markets. And that's kind of been the focus of the work that we've been doing in the offshore wind development program over the past 6 years. So I'll start with just giving an introduction to some of the work that we've been doing under the offshore wind development program over the past 6 years. And then I'll provide a bit of a description of what we've been seeing globally in the world of offshore wind and some of the developments in the more developed markets in Europe and Asia. And then thirdly, we'll want to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we've seen specifically in emerging markets, just the trajectory that they're on and some of the changes that we've seen take place over the last 5 to 6 years. And then we'll end with kind of a discussion on what this means for you. If you're working in the offshore wind supply chain or value chain, or you're a developer, financier, any part of the sector, what does this really mean for you in terms of an opportunity to be able to grow in these emerging markets, and why that might be an interesting thing to pursue? So the offshore wind development program is based in it's in the part of the World Bank, or in the World Bank group. It is within the World Bank. It is housed in a trust fund called the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, and this is a multi-donor trust fund that is supported by 16 countries around the world. And we're happy to include Canada in that list, and so we're very thankful for the support that Canada and the other countries of ESMAP provide us in being able to make the offshore wind program a reality. The program itself we first got the idea for it in 2017, managed to get funding for it in 2018, and we launched it in 2019. It has a very simple objective to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind in emerging markets, leading to a pipeline of bankable projects. Because ultimately the metric of success for the program is just steel in the water. It's as simple as that. We've worked with actually 26 emerging markets around the world, and Amanda mentioned the 8 that are the core for us. And so that's Philippines, Vietnam, India, Sri Lanka, South Africa, Turkey, Colombia, and Brazil. But we work with countries as small as Fiji, and as large as Romania, and Brazil, and many other countries. So kind of run the gamut. I'll talk a little bit about some of our outputs, but we have produced technical potential maps for pretty much every country on the planet. We've developed country roadmaps for 8 of the main countries that we work with. We developed 5 global reports, one called Making Offshore Wind Work, which is kind of our Bible. We've run 4 or 5 study tours now where we've taken government representatives from emerging markets and brought them to the UK, to the Netherlands, to Denmark to see offshore wind in action. And more we're providing bespoke guidance to governments through this dream team of advisors that we've assembled. And I'll talk about them in a minute. We have a lot of collaborators and partners that we work with. So the Global Wind Energy Council, the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, Ocean Energy Pathways, and then a number of the bilaterals like the Danish Energy Agency, RVO, etc. We'll pretty much work with anybody that's got similar goals to ours, and we find that there are certain things that we can do, certain things that we can't. But with this network of people of like-minded enterprises, collectively we're able to do just about anything. So the way that the program has kind of been working has changed a lot over the past 6 years. When we started out in 2019, if you went to somebody in Sri Lanka or in the Philippines or in Colombia and you said, what is the future of offshore wind in your government, in your country's energy plans, they would have said like, offshore what? It just didn't really register as part of their thinking. So a lot of the early work that we did was on technical potential mapping and doing study tours and just trying to increase kind of the literacy about offshore wind and what it might represent for a given country. What we found after that is that as countries started to get more engaged and they looked at these maps and saw offshore wind in operation, and they realized this could be a big part of their long-term energy future, they came to us and said, well, we want to develop roadmaps, which are essentially it describes all the pieces of the puzzle that have to be in place to make offshore wind work. These take us generally 2 to 3 years to develop. They're about $250,000 to do. It's a large exercise we undertake with the governments, but ultimately that essentially says, look, if here's some different paths that you can take to make offshore wind a part of your long-term energy plan, but here's all the bits from a commercial, financial, environmental, social standpoint that you need to put in place. And that's led much more to the actual implementation, because a lot of these governments have now said, okay, well, you developed this roadmap with us. Now we actually want to do it. So, can you work with us to actually make this a reality? So much more of the work that we do now is kind of this bespoke guidance for governments as they're implementing parts of their development plan, be it developing permitting systems or designating perimeters for development, or doing environmental and social work or safeguards, community engagement, looking at grid at ports, you name it. So I'd like to say that we kind of started 6 years ago at 100,000 feet, and then we moved down with the roadmaps to 50,000 feet. And now, much of the work that we're doing, we're very much in the weeds. So some of the work that we're doing at present, said we released this report called Making Offshore Wind Work. We released that just late last year. And if you want to sort of understand the DNA of the program and how we think about developing offshore wind in any market, be it an emerging market or an OECD country, this kind of spells out the 4 key pillars that have to be in place to make that happen. So this is free to download from our website. So please, invite you to download it, have a look. There's a couple studies that we're doing right now globally on ground conditions. This is we're working with WSP on this. Essentially, characterization of ground conditions and some ground risk in a lot of these emerging markets, because there's a lot of the characteristics of the ground in the seabed that are unknown in many of these countries where they just don't have this the depth of knowledge. So. Or the experience with working in the seabed. So it's a matter of characterizing the conditions and then feeding that into the marine spatial plan that a lot of these countries are developing. Similarly, we're doing a study on marine traffic and looking at how this impacts designation of perimeters and some risks that come along with designating particular parts of the seabed for development and how it interacts with marine traffic. The country work, as I said, is much more taking up much more of our time now. We're about to release the offshore wind roadmap for South Africa. We've been working in Brazil for the last 5 or 6 years on helping them with implementation now of the offshore wind law that they recently released, helping them with their stakeholder engagement plan and so on. In Philippines, some of you might know, we've been working very closely with the government on the release of this offshore wind auction called GF5 that they just came out with. And again, that's kind of getting into the weeds on the regulations and the port development that's required to make that a reality. We've also been working with the government of Colombia on their seabed tender, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then also on helping them to design their revenue scheme, the revenue support mechanism, the contract for difference. And then Vietnam, India, and all the other countries. Again, much of the work that we do is kind of this bespoke guidance with them on a day-to-day basis. So much of the work that we do is led by these 4 country leads, and all of them have between 15 to 20 years of experience in offshore wind. They all come from a developer background. Some of them also have some experience with Crown Estate. They are supported by this kind of constellation of advisors who also come from the private sector, from worked at Crown Estate and other entities, but all of them have between 12 to 20 years of experience in offshore wind, doing everything from resource measurement to site characterization to LCOE modeling to auction design. Hugh Denroyan used to run the Crown Estate for 8 years, so we've kind of got this dream team, and we essentially, with the countries that we work with, we say, well, this dream team is put at your disposal to help you work through all of the all the details that matter in making these objectives that you've now established a reality. All right. So now I'll talk a little bit about some of the current state of offshore wind in the world, and I think a lot of you are familiar with this already. But this chart, particularly famous from the Global Wind Energy Council, shows the average or the annual installations that have taken place over the past 15, 20 years. And one of the things to notice here is really that how much the development of offshore wind globally has been just dominated by Western Europe and China. It was mainly Western Europe, and then around 2016, 2017, the Chinese market started amping up. In 2021, it kind of went through the roof because of the end of the feed-in tariff, but it steadily continued. And almost every observer of the offshore wind market acknowledges that China is likely going to be the single largest country market for the foreseeable future. So it's kind of been chugging around, 8 gigawatts, 10 gigawatts installed per year. But this is steadily ramping up. And if you look at the projections of where offshore wind is going to be going, it's projected in 2025. Figures are not out yet, but somewhere around 15 gigawatts plus of offshore wind, new offshore wind will have come in. You go out to 2030, and that amount goes past 30 gigawatts of offshore wind being installed every year. And then up to 2034, you're over 50 gigawatts of offshore wind being installed every year. But what's interesting here is not necessarily how much is being built, but where it's being built. And you're starting to see a lot more diversification in the markets where the offshore wind is hitting the water. So a lot more installations in Southeast Asia, a lot more installations in Latin America and in emerging markets. And this is the diversification that we really want to see, because ultimately, when you've got a sector that's diversified across, truly is a global one and diversified across many markets, then it makes it gives it more momentum, and certainly is a better opportunity for those entering the supply and value chain. If you look kind of longer term, and there's all sorts of crazy estimates that are out there about what offshore wind can do. And really, if you look at the long-term projections, even despite the issues that the sector has gone through over the past couple of years, and I'll talk about that in a minute, pretty much every projection has offshore wind as a major part of many energy systems by 2040 or 2050. So the International Energy Agency came out with some estimates about what offshore wind has to grow to in order to to reach global net zero targets, and that's around 2,000 gigawatts by 2050. So but we know we're going to hit at least 300 gigawatts by 2030, and after that, it's a matter of how much is going to be added, not if. But it's important to recognize that it's been a pretty rough ride the past 2 to 3 years for offshore wind, and the sector was really hit with this perfect storm of conditions that made growth really tough. For those of you that work in the sector already, are acutely aware of these issues. Number one, the rising commodity prices. So the price of steel jumped by 40% over 2020 levels, and it still hasn't really gone back to where it was. Supply chain issues, getting things from point A to point B got really gummed up during COVID. And probably the third and biggest one is just the rising cost of capital. You look at the interbank lending rates in 2020 around 0.5%, and you look at them, in the last year they've been around 4.5%. So, and when you're building a $3 billion capex offshore wind farm, and you're effectively buying all your fuel up front, that's a big hit. Any change in the weighted average cost of capital of your project is going to have a massive impact on the levelized cost of energy that you're going to be able to get to make that project viable. So as a result, we saw, there were a couple of PPAs and tenders that were canceled, and certainly in the US this was the case. But we saw kind of a general flight to safety where a number of the larger developers and certainly oil and gas, we're saying, like, look, let's go back to our home markets. We're feeling a bit less adventurous because our board of directors are telling us that they're worried about the risk that represents. They want us to really focus on our home markets. So we saw this flight to safety. As a result of all this, you saw this, where the prices for offshore wind had been dropping steadily. All of a sudden, they started coming back up. One of the good indications of this is what happens in the UK, which is one of the leading, world's leading markets. So they have these allocation rounds that they go through, and probably many of you are familiar with this. The first allocation round that they went through in February 2015 came out with a cost of LCOE of around 167 pounds per megawatt hour, and that's in 2024 dollars. The auction round that they ran in 2017, the prices really dropped, and this was great. Went down around 80 pounds a megawatt hour, and then then all the exuberance kind of hit. And in 2019, everyone was really excited, and the prices that came in were around 55 to 60 pounds per megawatt hour. And that was all great, and then the issues started to hit the sector, and then allocation round 4 hit in 2022. Results were still actually pretty good. The market was still feeling pretty positive, and you had prices that were still around 55 to 60 pounds per megawatt hour. Then AR5 hit, and no one bid, and that was because all of these issues had hit the developers in such a way that they just couldn't meet the ceiling price that the Crown Estate had not adjusted. The Crown Estate adjusted the ceiling price upwards for allocation round 6, and that was September 2024, and then the prices came back up to where they had actually been back in 2017, to around 80 pounds per megawatt hour. There was a lot of speculation about where it was going to go from there in the UK, and there was really a worry that if they, for the next auction, AR7, that there would either be no bids or they would be astronomically, huge. They were looking at both fixed and floating. And we actually have the results from this that have just come in, and we're actually pretty pleasantly surprised with it. For the fixed foundation projects, this was 8.4 gigawatts that they awarded. 8.4 gigawatts for the UK is a tremendous amount. So it's a real vote of confidence, in the sector. And the average prices came in around 91 pounds per megawatt hour. And a lot of people really feel that this is a bit of an inflection point for the sector, and this is kind of a sign that it is starting to go through its recovery. As I said, there were some floating wind projects that were also bid into auction into allocation round 7. They came in quite high. There was only a couple of them. They were around 216 pounds per megawatt hour. There had been a lot of speculation, 3 or 4 years ago, that floating was going to rapidly decrease its costs. This is kind of an indication that the timeline for floating to take its place alongside fixed has been pushed out by a few years. The logic of floating still works, and it's going to play a huge role in the future. But as indicated by these results, it is a fair ways behind fixed foundation projects, at least for the time being. It's important to look at the kind of the state of development of offshore wind in Europe, and how, if you look at this map, which shows the state of things, seabed allocations or projects that have been fully commissioned, all the ones to the ones that are under development or at an early stage of planning. There's a lot of projects, and not many of them have actually really been developed. So the potential that offshore wind has across Western Europe is still largely untapped, and there's a lot more that can be developed before you ever get to a level of saturation. But it's this kind of market maturity, I think, that really represents sort of this healthy route for for the industry going forward. And as it navigates through these different things that are thrown at it through politics, like ultimately, the logic of offshore wind remains the same. It is large scale, reliable, competitively priced power that is located close to demand. And so now I wanted to shift a little bit of that thinking and look now, well, what does this mean for the emerging markets and the ones that we've been working with? As I said, we've done mapping for pretty much every country in the world, and this logic of offshore wind, the physics of it, remains the same. And we find that in pretty much every region that we work in, we see a huge potential for offshore wind, and these are right next to major demand centers. So our mapping showed there's about 16 terawatts of total technical potential. Out of that, about 2/3 of that is floating, and 1/3 of it is fixed. All this to say that if you develop all of this offshore wind, it'll power the globe many times over. So it's not a lack of wind or resource that will constrain offshore wind going forward. When you look at some of the countries that we've been working in, and again, when you go back to 2019, offshore wind was not only not part of their energy plans, it wasn't even on most countries' minds. They didn't even realize what kind of a potential they had. So places like Colombia and Philippines, Brazil had some early interest in offshore wind, but Romania, Vietnam, it definitely wasn't in their energy plans. And if you asked them what their potential was, they just they had no idea. So as I said, we worked with them through this early technical potential mapping, and then developing the roadmaps, and then going up to implementation. And you get up to where they are now, which is pretty remarkable. The case of Colombia, and I'll talk about that more specifically in a second. They're targeting 13 gigawatts by 2050. That's a huge part of their total energy demand. They have just, they've completed this RFQ. They are going through a seabed allocation process specifically for offshore wind. It's a big part of their energy planning going forward. In the Philippines, same thing, as they've announced, or they just launched GF5, which is a specific offshore wind tender. There's 90 service contracts there that they've signed for about 67 gigawatts. This first tranche of projects is going to be about 3.3 gigawatts. Brazil, as I think many of you know, there's been an offshore wind law that was passed in 2025. There is a decree that they're coming out with in mid 2026. They've got more permits than they've got an insane number of permits that are underway. I mean, in Brazil, it's not a matter of if, it's when and where. There's 3 zones, in particular in Brazil, that they're interested in developing. But Brazil sees this as a big part of their long-term energy planning. Even Romania and the Black Sea, we worked with them on developing their offshore wind law, which they launched in, I guess it was a year and a half ago, and it targets about 3 gigawatts. And we're working with them now to try to, under the it's decreed by the law, they have to issue this this auction in 2026. So then Vietnam, it's went from pretty much zero to Power Development Plan 8, which they released last year, foresees over 110 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. Because for them, it's energy security. They've got really two huge resources. They've got gas and they've got offshore wind. And they know that if they want to achieve energy security, then they'll have to develop both those resources. So I want to take a second just to talk about two specific countries, Colombia and the Philippines, and kind of the story of their development over the past few years. So in the case of Colombia, said we issued the first technical potential mapping back in 2019, and there's an area of Colombia called La Guajira that has some of the most insane offshore wind resources on the planet. It's like regularly 12, 13 meter per second average winds in that area. This caught the attention of the government. This is the government previous to the current Petro government. And they asked us to develop a roadmap, which we did. They promptly published it as their own and said, this is our roadmap. The government changed to the current administration, and then they just kind of picked up where the last government left off. And they issued a resolution, basically establishing responsibility for different parts of implementation of the offshore wind roadmap. And we've been working with them ever since on trying to developing each one of these work streams that they have on volumes and targets, on seabed conditions, on grid, on ports, on financing. We helped them to develop their first, the CFD, this contract for difference mechanism. It's the first one in Latin America. Helping them on standards for HSE, et cetera. And a lot of our work is being led by Carolina Damas and Claire McGregor, who are shown here, our advisors working closely with the government. And again, this is, this kind of hand-holding and helping them through the details of implementation have been a really big part of Colombia's offshore wind journey. And we saw that there was a seabed, or there was a qualification round that they ran through. They got 8 pre-qualified bidders, and then there was one that submitted a bid in October 2025. That was Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, which was a great sort of vote of confidence in the market in Colombia going forward. And they're aiming ultimately from this process to get 1 to 3 gigawatts. Turning to the Philippines, and again, we released this map back in 2019, got a lot of attention, and the government said, we want you to develop a roadmap. So we did this. And then that quickly transformed into, the current administration basically seized on this, and they said, we want to have offshore wind in the water by 2028, which is pretty ambitious. But, when the rubber hits the road, and, they really, proved their conviction and their interest in pursuing this. So they launched GF5 in November 2025, and that had these targets. They wanted to get 3.3 gigawatts of fixed bottom projects, particularly targeted what they call these front runners. We worked with them also on figuring out what the LCOE might be, and they issued a ceiling price. It was announced in December, and they are looking to conduct the auction in between April and September of this year. So again, that's kind of going from zero to a fairly significant amount of offshore wind in the Philippines in a relatively short period of time. And over the long terms, they've got bigger ambitions for the role that it can play. Their interest is primarily in energy security and in using their domestic resources to reduce their reliance on imports. So stepping kind of the last part of the presentation, where I wanted to talk about what this means for for the Canadian offshore wind sector, and for folks that are working in either in finance or value chain or supply chain or services, etc. I think really the big message that comes out is, like, if you take all of these markets that I've talked about, any one of them individually, you might go, well, this is pretty small, I'm not sure if this is worth pursuing. If you take them collectively, it becomes quite interesting. So out of the 7 core markets that are listed here, they have a target of developing about 35 gigawatts in the next 10 years. So, this kind of indicates that it's, if you wanted to start hedging your bets and diversifying, looking out to these markets is actually a pretty interesting proposition. And there are some sort of specific areas I think that that emerge, and some companies that that have shown what can be done in this space. On supply chain, as many of you know, there's potential for supply of components to some of these projects. So LM, produced some of the blades for projects in the U.S. Vineyard, Marmon, building foundations and towers. Obviously, I have to tool up to be able to get into offshore wind structures, which are significantly larger. Developers, Northland Power has been a really an amazing example of what you can do. The Canadian developer that's been active in developing offshore wind in Germany and Taiwan, Poland, and Scotland. Consultants, very strong sector, obviously, in onshore wind and in offshore wind as well. You've got groups like Stantec, WSP, TNB, a number of others that are present in Canada that actually do a lot of work in offshore wind already. Finance, you've got CDPQ, Teachers, Brookfield, and a number of other financial institutions that are already quite active in financing offshore wind in certainly Western Europe, and increasingly looking at emerging markets as well. And then finally, utilities, providing support on HVDC systems for export, for onshore, for offshore wind related projects around the world. So the scale of the market is there, and certainly the existing capacities are certainly there. It's a matter of working to accelerate this and expanding it in a greater way. I mean, the most immediate opportunity is likely outside of the U.S. market, which has a lot of question marks around it. In Latin America, there's about 7.7 gigawatts of potential that's out there. I mentioned some of the work we've been doing in Colombia and Brazil. We're actually just starting an offshore wind roadmap for Mexico, which has an interesting potential in the Pacific and also in the Caribbean sides. We're doing an offshore wind roadmap for Chile right now. Chile has screaming winds, amazing resource. It's deep though. This will likely be a lot of floating foundations. And Argentina and Uruguay and a number of other countries have done various efforts to try to pursue offshore wind, but certainly South America and Latin America and the Caribbean represents an interesting near-term opportunity. That's not so far away as places like Philippines and Vietnam. There was a study that MRC did, was really fantastic, and this is the kind of work that I think that I really applaud. Looking at opportunities for supply chain in the near and to midterm, focusing specifically on Brazil, but it also looks at opportunities in a few other countries. Brazil is a really cool market. It is expanding. It's going to be, it's going to take it a while to get steel in the water. The estimates are that it'll take about 8 years for the first offshore wind farms to be commissioned. But they've got a huge supply chain. They've got a huge value chain. We saw this in the growth of their onshore wind sector. That they really, when they take this seriously, they really move on it. And so that represents a really interesting opportunity. And this report actually had some good, provides some good granularity in terms of where Canada's supply chain strengths might be used in places like Brazil and Latin America. What we often find in the markets where we work is that you get a lot of great local knowledge, but they don't necessarily have much international experience. And I think kind of the dream combination is when you've got an international entity that understands what the norms are, for the global sector, and that partners up with a local entity that has, that local knowledge and the connections and just the understanding of the environment. When that marriage happens, I think that provides for a really strong, a very competitive player. So I think, as you look at these markets and you're sort of dipping your toe in the water, considering partnering with some of the stronger firms, to be able to manage this risk, to be able to provide the understanding that you'll need in the long term. And this is not a short-term play. This is not something that's it's going to take 2, 3, 5, 10 years to really mature. But that initial, we've seen this where that initial sort of foray into these markets helping to develop that understanding matures into something where you can actually do considerable business as the market really comes into its own. So I'll close with saying kind of, I guess, three big messages I think that come out of this. Number one is that offshore wind it's growing quickly, and it's just physics. As I said before, large scale, clean, competitively priced power located close to demand. And it's this has always been the case, and it always will be the case. The growth so far has been focused on Europe and China, and there's no doubt that the sector has hit some headwinds. But as we've seen, these are they're considerable, but they're also surmountable. And I think the results from the allocation round 7 in the UK show just how resilient the sector really can be. We think that emerging markets are going to be an increasingly prominent and important part of the offshore wind narrative going forward. If it's going to become a truly global industry, emerging markets have to be a part of it. And really, our job, as the World Bank and as the Offshore Wind Development Program, is to really work with these countries to make sure that they, as they build their sectors, that those projects are bankable, and helping them kind of to establish the foundations that they need to be able to attract international caliber developers and supply chain is going to be a big part of success for their markets. And I think that as these emerging markets grow, there's huge opportunity for industry. I think it's important as a diversification opportunity for the international supply and value chain. And I remember back in 2006, 2010, as the Canadian onshore market was kind of growing, we used to have this issue where the federal subsidies would kind of drop out, but then the PTC in the US would go up, and all of a sudden these developers would go to the States, and they would go there, and then the PTC would kind of drop out, and then one of the provinces would have an auction, and then all the developers would kind of come back. And I think a lot of the onshore sector survived by being able to diversify across the two countries, and I think that they used that to diversify into other countries as well. And I think a lot of the top performers now have learned that lesson. I think it's the same thing with offshore wind. I think that making those early bets and trying to diversify into some of these more exotic markets over the long term really pays dividends, because there's really safety and diversity. And that's the last slide. I just wanted to thank you for your time, and happy to take questions. Just before I do this, I wanted to share with you one of my team members, Mark Laybourne, helped me with these slides, and he was aware of that this was a bit of a homecoming for me, and he's saying it's going to be funny for you to go back and present on offshore wind in Canada. And in the slide deck, he threw in a bit of a surprise. He put this slide in, which kind of summarizes, I guess, one of the basic messages here, which is it's a pretty good opportunity. So anyway, there you go.
Perfect.
I'll hand it back to you, Amanda. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And we've worked with Mark before too. He's fantastic. So we know Mark. So is there any questions for Sean? I have a few that I can ask as well. I'm not seeing any in the chat. So maybe I'll start some things off. And that was a great presentation. Thank you very much for that. So you mentioned some of the challenges the industry has had over the past couple of years. So given the recent cost inflation, canceled tenders globally, and you alluded to this a bit, how are emerging market governments adjusting auction design or revenue support to keep projects bankable?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a big shift in 2021, 2022, a place like Colombia or Philippines would launch, if they would have launched a tender, they would have had, developers beating down their door. In 2025 and 2026, it's very different because of this flight to safety. So one of the things we've done with these governments is to really work with them to engage with developers and with the offshore wind sector to understand what their needs are, because they really have to make themselves appealing to those players if they're going to bring them in. And a lot of that is engagement, and we've worked on these bilaterals and bringing officials together with developers to understand what those needs are. But a lot of it is in the details. It's like risk allocation. It's just basics around the PPA structure, around using a CFD as a mechanism, and using some of the lessons learned from developed markets in designing these things to be able to attract developers, because you can run whatever auction you want, but if no one comes to your party, then it's not going to work very well. So we try to help them recognize that this is a changing landscape, and they need to be proactive, and they really need to focus on bankability, because without that, it all falls apart. So that's, I think, what certainly in the case of Colombia and the Philippines, I think things that lessons that they've really taken to heart. And I think that's why we're seeing really good participation in those processes.
Perfect. Okay, we do have a question in there, a few of them actually coming in. So I'll start with first. With cost of capital being one of the biggest challenges of offshore wind development, and capital typically being more expensive in emerging markets, will offshore wind still remain cost competitive?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a report that we released about 2 years ago that actually looked at the role of concessional finance in helping to spur the first offshore wind farms in emerging markets. Because you got to recognize that if the Philippines or Colombia for their tenders, they're not going to get the same kind of prices that the UK got, because it's a developed market. So the first projects are going to be a bit of a bitter pill to swallow, because as you said, the cost of capital is going to be higher. There's going to be the risk, the perception of risk is going to be higher, and they don't have the same kind of supply chain development. So those first projects are going to be tough to swallow. So we've been working with governments through this, trying to look at ways that we can potentially use concessional climate finance as a way to reduce how bitter that pill is, to get them on the learning curve to get to a point where offshore wind is competitive. It's interesting in the case of India, where we've been working quite a bit lately. There was something called viability gap funding that they had announced. That was going to be used to defray the cost of those first projects, and we've been trying to help them figure out how that can be used in a way that can get them most quickly to a point where the offshore wind is competitive. And so we've been focusing them particularly on Tamil Nadu, which has a fantastic wind resource, looking at potential mechanisms like CFD, but also just making sure that they recognize that the first projects are going to be tough, but it's you have to get over those, as any sector does, in order to eventually go down the cost curve. But we have a big role in this also as the bank. I mean, at the end of the day, the World Bank provides financing to governments. The IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, provides funding to the private sector. And that's kind of where, what we say to these countries, as you develop the sector, like, we can help finance your infrastructure, your ports, your supply chain, on both the private sector and public sector side, to make this an easier thing to do. But you got to focus on bankability. That's where it sort of starts and stops. So, yeah.
Thank you. There's a few questions that have come in. Some of them are ones I was going to ask, so that's great. The next is, within the emerging markets, we are seeing more local company as the prime for developing projects, some with larger developers from EU or elsewhere and others without. Can you speak to this shift?
You mean to the shift in local developers?
I think that's what he's saying. Yeah, local versus international developers.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. You look at the case of Poland, or Poland early on in its development. Generally you had these consortia that formed of Polish players, either state-owned enterprises or private entities that teamed with experienced international developers, and they use this as a way of kind of getting this magic, international experience, but local sort of awareness. The question is, in subsequent tenders, if those local players are going to take more of a prominent role. It takes a lot to learn offshore wind. Like, offshore wind is think everyone knows, is exceedingly difficult. This is not onshore wind. It's definitely not solar. It's a tough sector to get right. So we think that those partnerships ultimately, will serve best if they last a long time. And so it takes more than just one auction to really make it work. A place like Colombia, we saw there was a lot of partnerships that they were looking at initially. Had been looking at requiring that, and then they kind of let off on that requirement. But ultimately, I think you know um, moving too quickly to just local, I think, is a tough thing to do for offshore wind. And we see this in supply chain a lot. There's one of the a number of countries that say, well, we want to have our own local supply chain. We want to have local content requirements. And we say, like, look, you got to walk before you run. Make sure that you get those partnerships that build a solid foundation. And the best thing you can do for local supply chain is just volume. It's not through heavy-handed local content requirements. So yeah, I think that as the volumes increase and as they set international standards for the performance of and the construction of the wind farms, I think you're always going to have the consortia forming of the international players with the local entities. I wouldn't see that changing hugely going forward. At least not until they get those big volumes and they get the cost down and then are able to go down the learning curve.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, a few more. So I think we're going to use up all our time with these questions, which is great. So there's one, this one's a bit involved. So thanks for the global overview. For Canadian firms in Nova Scotia, and I'll add maritime provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador as well, where we are building our offshore wind supply chain that's specific to Nova Scotia with strong oil and gas and maritime expertise. What specific opportunities do you see for us to engage in emerging markets like Brazil, Colombia, or India? And how can we best position our local workforce and ports?
Yeah,
That's a big one. So,
yeah, it's a big one. I mean, there's no doubt that it's interesting for those of you that have gone to if you ever go up to Newcastle in the UK. I mean, it was an oil and gas town. It was largely built on development of oil and gas. And it's funny when you go to the companies that are there. A lot of them kind of realized that the capacities that they had to work in oil and gas were equally applicable in offshore wind. So, cables, ground investigations. I think that transformation happens, slowly as a business that is working on building cables, for example, like a part of their business starts out being offshore wind, and then eventually it moves, largely into offshore wind. And now a place like Newcastle, they've got some like 20,000 people that work in offshore wind. They used to work in oil and gas, but they were able to shift their operations and focus more on offshore wind. And they still have that flexibility. They're able to go back into oil and gas when it depends on what kind of contracts are there. So I think that's that. I mean, you can't underestimate the knowledge that comes with just understanding seabed conditions and particularly geotechnical, geophysical surveys. When you go into a place like Philippines or Sri Lanka, I mean, they just don't, like, this is not something that they're used to doing. So I think I wouldn't underestimate sort of what you already know from the groundwork that you've done just from your day-to-day work in offshore oil and gas. It's a matter of being able to apply that within the context with a good local partner who understands, who has that local awareness. Because so it's I would look to the examples certainly in the Netherlands, in the UK, for how they've been able to transition their particular sectors to offshore wind. It's kind of like it's slowly and then suddenly, I think, depending on where the demand comes from.
perfect. Thank you. And then also with hurricanes, a growing concern in emerging offshore wind markets like the Caribbean and the Philippines, how do environmental hazards impact the design and resilience of fixed versus floating foundations? And what strategies do you recommend for Canadian suppliers to support those solutions?
Okay. Yeah, I mean it's a really great question. I mean, there's no doubt that this is mainly an issue these days in Southeast Asia. In the Philippines, it's been a big question because they do get hit with typhoons. We've certainly seen some of this in Taiwan, although the Taiwanese projects are generally protected by from the direct hit of the Category 5. I mean, we know that you know these are kind of design conditions for the machines. I mean, we did financing of an onshore wind farm in Jamaica. This was back in 2016, and that wind farm a few months ago got hit by a Category 5 hurricane that missed it by about 25 kilometers. It wiped out a solar farm, but the wind farm was up and running. It suffered cosmetic damage because it's designed for these kind of environments. Well, not for Category 5 is pretty extreme, but it's a matter of just understanding the design conditions and being able to it's really a design parameter for the machine. The foundations are another thing. That's a tougher one because one of the problems in a way with the offshore wind sector in Europe is that it kind of grew up in the North Sea, which has this sandy ground conditions, and it's perfect. It's like it's you can't find better geotechnical conditions for offshore wind. In places like Korea, and in Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines, the ground conditions are brutal, and designing for hurricanes around the machines is not so bad. Designing for hurricanes around the foundations and around seismic risk is big. So again, it's just being able to take the lessons learned that we've had from developed markets, understand that the conditions in emerging markets are different, and focusing on that. I'm less worried about the machines than about the foundations. Yeah.
Right. We have two more questions. We'll see if we can get to both of them before our time's up. First one is what do you recommend for ways for small companies to enter emerging markets? That was kind of broad, but yeah.
I mean, I think we were saying, Amanda, before that you're organizing a delegation of companies to Wind Europe this year, and I would strongly suggest joining that. It's like Wind Europe has increasingly become what we call like the watering hole for the global wind industry. It's focused on Europe, but everybody comes in. We've got a delegation coming from the Philippines to Wind Europe, and we're going to have another number of other countries there. It's really just on the trade show floor, just kind of getting a feel for who's doing what, and then you will find people from Brazil, Philippines, Colombia, Sri Lanka, India. They will all be there. It's a matter of being able to connect with them as a small business, and then help them to understand kind of what your niche is, and ultimately use that as a way to understand their market conditions and some of their players. It's really just you can kind of do a distant market study, or you can kind of go and find somebody from that place and kind of shake their hand and get to know them. So, and I think that's probably, in my experience, that's been the best strategy for connecting with these, particularly for smaller players. And, you can't go on some huge junket to like 20 countries. It's pretty expensive. So you can check a lot of those boxes by going to Wind Europe and the major trade shows. Because that's in Wind Energy Hamburg as well, because that's where a lot of the action happens. So that'd be my suggestion.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and one thing we do is we do contract a consultant to actually work with our participating companies in this mission to help them identify who they should be talking to or just making those connections. So they have some assistance to do that too, which is great. So one more quick question I'll throw out there. I know we're at time. In your view, is Canada an emerging market for offshore wind? Now, also, where would it fall on the spectrum of emerging versus mature? But obviously, we're not mature yet. But what's your overview, I guess, of Canada?
Yeah, I mean, you've got, so if you look at this, the publication that we came out with called "Making Offshore Wind Work," there's kind of 4 pillars that have to be in place. You need you need strategies, you need policies, you need frameworks, and you need delivery. In a lot of the places where we work, the emerging markets like Chile and Mexico or India, a lot of that early framework is not really there, and you're kind of building it from the ground up. I mean, in Canada, the nice thing is you've got a lot of those foundations that are already in place. You've got from a strong policy declaration, you've got the basic tenets of bankability already there. You have established contracts for PPAs. You've got established risk allocation on permits and in the regulations. So from that perspective, yeah, you're already you're definitely beyond an emerging market because you're not really building it from the ground up. You're already just you're starting. You're kind of hitting the ground running, as it were. So I think that's why I would not consider it an emerging market in the sense of kind of building it from the ground up. And like I'd be shocked if Canada does not have like a lot of offshore wind in the water in 10 to 15 years. Because I mean you've got screaming winds, you've got geotechnical conditions that you understand just because of the history in oil and gas. And you appear to have very strong political motivation to make it a reality. So yeah, and you've got bankable off takers. You've got a lot of the parts of the puzzle that you need. Strong environmental and social legislation. A lot of those parts of the puzzle that you need are already in place. It's a matter of just kind of kickstarting it. But that's, I guess, what all of you are doing now, and I applaud you for it. So
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's certainly the plan. So hopefully it's a different conversation in 5 or so years. So we are now a few minutes over. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and specifically Sean. Thank you so much. This was a fantastic presentation, very thoughtful, very informative. And I know that people are going to be able to take away a lot from this. So I will mention our next webinar of this series will be in the spring. So stay tuned for more details on the topic or market that will be highlighted and the date. And I will mention to all of our members on this webinar, we welcome feedback from our members anytime. So if you have suggested topics or markets you would like to hear more about, please don't hesitate to send me an email. And I'm always happy to have a chat if you'd prefer to chat over the phone. So with that, we will end it. Again, thank you so much, Sean. Very much appreciated. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
thanks so much, Amanda. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks. See
All
you
right.
later, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.